The Galactic Museum of Ancient Artifacts was not your typical weekend tourist spot. This place housed the most dangerous objects in the known universe, and every single item could kill you in ways that would make your worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams. The museum floated in the neutral zone between three major alien empires, and its reputation for safety was about as solid as wet tissue paper. Museum director Hyun-woo had been running this death trap for 15 years, and he still woke up every morning wondering if today would be the day something finally broke loose and turned him into space dust. He was a careful man, the kind who checked his locks 3 times before bed and always carried 2 backup plans for his backup plans. Right now, he stood in front of the museum's most notorious exhibit, adjusting his protective gear for what felt like the 100th time that morning. The Vorthak battlesuit sat behind barriers that could stop a small moon from crashing through. It looked like someone had carved armor from the heart of a dying star and then taught it to hate everything that breathed. The suit was pure black, but not the simple black of paint or cloth. This was the kind of black that seemed to swallow light and spit it back out as malice. Its surface moved constantly, rippling and shifting like oil on water, and if you stared at it too long, you could swear it was staring right back at you. Bo-Ra, Hyun-woo's assistant, walked up beside him, carrying a data pad that trembled slightly in her hands. She had been working at the museum for 3 years, but she still jumped every time she had to come near this particular exhibit. Bo-Ra was young, smart, and had the kind of nervous energy that came from being surrounded by ancient weapons of mass destruction all day long. "Sir, we have another update on the casualty count," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Even though the barriers were supposedly soundproof, everyone who worked near the Vorthak suit spoke quietly, as if raising their voice might wake something up that was better left sleeping. Hyun-woo sighed and took the datapad. The numbers made his stomach turn. Another one died trying to wear it last week. That makes 847 confirmed deaths across all species in the past millennium. The list of failed attempts read like a who's who of the galaxy's most powerful beings. Zephyrian warriors with their diamond-hard skin had lasted exactly 12 seconds before the suit turned them inside out. A crystalline hive mind, beings made of living mineral who were practically indestructible, had managed 37 seconds before the armor somehow convinced their molecules to stop cooperating with each other. Just last month, a transcendent, energy being, something that existed as pure thought and power, had tried to merge with the suit. The cleanup crew was still finding pieces of concentrated consciousness floating around the exhibit hall. The warnings around the display case were written in every major language in the galaxy, and some that had been dead for millions of years. The message was always the same. No matter what script or symbols were used, death to all who dare. The Vorthak's vengeance lives. Some of the warnings were carved into metal that had turned to rust around the words. Others were written in materials that changed color when you looked at them, cycling through shades that seemed to spell out additional threats in languages that bypassed your ears and spoke directly to the fear centers of your brain. But the most unsettling thing about the armor was not its kill count or its reputation. It was the way it seemed aware. Security cameras around the exhibit would sometimes malfunction, showing the suit in slightly different positions than where it had been moments before. Guards reported feeling watched when they did their rounds, even though the suit had no visible eyes or sensors. More than one night shift worker had quit after claiming they could hear the armor whispering in languages that predated their species. The bounty notice posted next to the warnings was almost insulting in its simplicity. 50 million credit bounty, successfully wear the Vorthak suit for 1 hour. The reward had been posted by an anonymous collector who apparently had more money than sense and wanted to see if anyone could actually survive long enough to claim it. In 15 years, nobody had even come close. That was exactly the moment when Jun-ho stumbled through the museum's main entrance. Jun-ho was having what could generously be called a bad day, and what would more accurately be described as the latest chapter in a bad life. He was a human mercenary, which in the galactic community was roughly equivalent to being a cosmic joke that occasionally carried weapons. Humans were known throughout the galaxy for 2 things: their complete inability to understand when they were outmatched, and their disturbing tendency to survive situations that should have killed them through sheer bloody-minded stubbornness. He owed money to at least 6 different crime syndicates, had been banned from 4 star systems, and his last job had ended with him accidentally starting a small war between 2 peaceful trading colonies. The loan sharks were getting creative with their threats, and Junho was running out of places to hide. He had ducked into the museum, hoping to lose his latest set of pursuers in the maze of exhibits, but what he found instead was opportunity. His eyes, bloodshot from too little sleep and too much cheap liquor, scanned the museum displays with the desperate focus of a man looking for any way out of his problems. That was when he saw the bounty notice, 50 million credits, enough to pay off his debts, buy a decent ship, and maybe even take a vacation on a planet where nobody was actively trying to murder him. Junho had never been accused of being overly intelligent, but he had survived this long by being willing to take risks that more sensible people wouldn't even consider. He looked at the warning signs, looked at the casualty count, looked at the armor that seemed to pulse with barely contained hatred, and then looked back at the number on the bounty notice. He cracked his knuckles, a habit he had picked up during his brief career as a pit fighter on the mining colonies. The sound echoed off the museum walls like small bones breaking. "Well," Junho muttered to himself, already walking toward the information desk, "I've had worse Tuesdays." The museum board meeting that followed Junho's request was the kind of bureaucratic circus that only happened when desperate people met equally desperate institutions. The Galactic Museum of Ancient Artifacts was hemorrhaging money faster than a punctured fuel tank, and the insurance companies were threatening to drop their coverage entirely if one more exhibit tried to eat a visitor. Hyun-woo sat at the head of the conference table, his face buried in his hands as he listened to Junho's presentation. The human had somehow procured what looked like legitimate mercenary credentials, complete with holographic seals and reference letters from organizations that Hyun-woo was pretty sure didn't exist. But the paperwork looked official enough to fool the museum's legal department, which was staffed by overworked interns who were just happy that someone else was willing to take responsibility for once. "Let me get this straight," said board member Kyung-soo, an elderly centaurian whose species was known for their obsession with proper procedures. "You want us to let you attempt to wear the most dangerous artifact in our collection, despite the fact that it has a 100% fatality rate across all known species?" Junho leaned back in his chair with the kind of relaxed confidence that came from having absolutely nothing left to lose. "That's exactly right. And according to your own legal charter, Section 47, subsection 12, any sentient being with proper documentation and proof of combat experience has the right to attempt interaction with museum artifacts, provided they sign the appropriate waivers." Bora frantically flipped through the museum's legal documents, her eyes growing wider with each page. "He's right," she whispered to Hyun-woo. "It's an old colonial law that nobody ever bothered to repeal. Technically, we can't refuse him as long as he meets the minimum requirements." The room erupted in arguments. Half the board members were terrified of the liability, while the other half were quietly calculating how much money they could make, from selling exclusive broadcast rights to what would undoubtedly be the most spectacular death in museum history. The insurance representative, a nervous Aquarian named Dong-min, kept muttering about policy violations and premium increases. But Junho had done his homework. He had spent the last 3 hours in the museum's public access terminals, reading every regulation, every legal precedent, and every loophole he could find. The man might not have been book smart, but he had a street-level cunning that came from years of talking his way out of impossible situations. "Furthermore," Junho continued, producing another set of documents, "according to galactic salvage law, if I successfully bond with the armor for the required 1 hour, I become its legal owner. That means the museum gets to keep the 50 million credit bounty as a finder's fee, while I get the suit itself. Everyone wins." That last part got the board's attention. 50 million credits would solve a lot of their financial problems, and they would still have the most famous exhibit in the galaxy. The only downside was the virtual certainty that they would be cleaning human remains off the display case within the next hour. The vote was closer than it should have been, 5 members voted yes, 3 voted no, and 1 abstained because he was having an existential crisis about the nature of museum ethics. Hyunwoo cast the tie-breaking vote with all the enthusiasm of a man signing his own termination papers. 2 hours later, they stood in the maximum security wing as technicians powered down the quantum barriers for the first time in 50 years. The process took forever, with each safety system requiring multiple authorization codes and biometric confirmations. Hyunwoo had insisted on evacuating the entire wing, except for essential personnel, which meant that only he, Bo-Ra, and a skeleton crew of security guards were present to witness what everyone expected to be Junho's spectacular demise. "This is madness," Hyunwoo whispered, as the final barrier flickered and died. The Vorthak battlesuit stood exposed for the first time in decades, its dark surface rippling with malevolent energy. The suit has killed Zephyrians with their diamond-hard skin, crystalline hive minds who are practically indestructible, even a transcendent energy being just last month. What makes you think a human can survive what they couldn't? Junho shrugged, already walking toward the armor with the casual gait of someone heading to grab a beer rather than face almost certain death. Maybe I'm lucky, maybe I'm stupid, maybe both. But I've been broke and desperate before, and somehow I'm still here. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? Bo-Ra started to list the various ways the previous victims had died, but Hyunwoo stopped her with a gesture. There was no point in dwelling on the gruesome details. Either Junho would join the casualty list, or something unprecedented would happen. Given the human's track record for surviving impossible situations, Hyunwoo wasn't entirely sure which outcome was more likely. The armor seemed to sense Junho's approach. Its surface began moving more rapidly, dark patterns swirling across, its surface like storm clouds gathering before a hurricane. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and several of the security guards stepped back instinctively. Even the monitoring equipment began registering energy spikes that had never appeared in previous attempts. Junho reached out with the kind of casual confidence that came from someone who had already made peace with terrible decisions. His fingers were inches from the dark metal when Bo-Ra called out one last warning. "The longest anyone has survived contact is 37 seconds. "Good to know," Junho replied, and pressed his palm against the armor's chest plate. The expected screams of agony never came. Instead, something unprecedented happened. The armor purred. It was a sound like distant thunder, mixed with the contentment of a massive predator that had just found exactly what it was looking for. The dark surface began to glow with an inner light that was somehow both beautiful and terrifying. A voice resonated in Junho's mind, ancient and amused, speaking in a language that bypassed his ears and communicated directly with his thoughts. Finally, a warrior with perfect combat instinct and beautiful stupidity, the armor flowed onto Junho like liquid starlight, conforming to his body with the precision of something that had been waiting millennia for exactly this moment. Where the suit touched his skin, he felt power flowing into him, enhancing every muscle, sharpening every reflex and filling his mind with tactical knowledge that belonged to civilizations that had turned to dust before his species had learned to make fire. The AI within the armor introduced itself with the kind of formal politeness that belonged to a different age. "I am Wrath, combat intelligence of the Vorthak warrior caste. I was programmed eons ago to bond only with beings possessing the rarest combination of tactical brilliance and reckless courage. You, human, appear to possess both qualities in abundance." Junho flexed his newly enhanced muscles, feeling strength flowing through him like electricity through copper wire. The armor fit him perfectly, as if it had been custom-made for his exact specifications. He could feel Wrath's presence in his mind, not controlling but advising, like having the galaxy's most experienced military strategist as a personal consultant. "You know," Junho said aloud, his voice now carrying the slight electronic undertone that came from speaking through the armor's communication systems. "I think we're going to get along just fine." The silence in the room was deafening. For the first time in 1,000 years, someone had successfully bonded with the Vorthak battlesuit and lived to tell about it. The moment Junho successfully bonded with the Vorthak armor, automated systems that had been dormant for centuries suddenly came alive across the galaxy. Ancient warning beacons, buried deep in forgotten databases and emergency protocols, began transmitting coded messages to every major power in known space. The signal was simple but terrifying. The Vorthak had returned. In the crystalline throne, chambers of the hegemony of perfect beings, located in the heart of their capital world Perfection Prime, Supreme Commander Taimin was reviewing daily reports when every alarm in the palace began screaming at once. The hegemony controlled 90% of known space through a combination of superior technology, flawless strategy, and the absolute certainty that they were the most evolved beings in the universe. They had spent millennia perfecting themselves, removing every flaw, every weakness, every trace of the chaotic unpredictability that plagued lesser species. Taimin himself was a perfect example of their philosophy. His features were mathematically precise, each angle and curve calculated to inspire awe and obedience. His skin had a subtle luminescence that marked him as one of the genetically enhanced ruling class, and his movements possessed the fluid grace that came from centuries of biomechanical optimization. He was, by every measure his society valued, absolutely perfect, which was why the message appearing on his command screen filled him with a dread so pure it made his perfect features contort into something almost resembling emotion. "Impossible," he hissed, his voice carrying harmonics that had been engineered to command instant obedience from lesser beings. The Vorthak armor was sealed for a reason. No species should be able to activate it. We made sure of that. Yu Jin, his personal aide and the second most perfect being in the hegemony hierarchy, burst into the throne chamber without the usual ceremonial announcements. Her normally flawless composure was cracked with something that looked suspiciously like panic, which should have been impossible given her genetic modifications. "Sir," she interrupted, holding a data crystal that pulsed with urgent red light, "the bonding was successful. The armor is fully active. All monitoring stations confirm it. The Vorthak battlesuit has chosen a new host." Taimin rose from his throne, which was carved from a single piece of living crystal that responded to his emotional state. Right now, the crystal was turning deep red, reflecting his inner turmoil. He had lived for over 3,000 years, had conquered star systems, and destroyed entire civilizations, but the name Vorthak still made him feel something he had thought he had evolved beyond: fear. The ancient records were stored in the deepest vaults of the hegemony archives, protected by security measures that could vaporize small planets. Taimin accessed them with trembling fingers, reading again the history that had haunted his nightmares for millennia. The Vorthak had been the only species in galactic history to defeat the hegemony in open warfare. Not once, but repeatedly, across dozens of star systems and hundreds of battles. What made the Vorthak so dangerous was not just their individual strength or their advanced technology, it was their complete unpredictability. Where the hegemony relied on perfect strategy and flawless execution, the Vorthak thrived on chaos and improvisation. They would charge into battle with plans that made no logical sense, adapt their tactics mid-fight based on pure instinct, and somehow emerge victorious against opponents who should have crushed them through sheer numerical superiority. Their armor was the pinnacle of their military technology, containing advanced AI systems that were designed to learn and evolve with each conflict. The armor didn't just protect its wearer, it enhanced their natural abilities, provided tactical analysis, and most importantly, it grew stronger with every battle. The hegemony had spent centuries trying to understand how the Vorthak technology worked, but it defied every principle of logical engineering. The war between the hegemony and the Vorthak had lasted for over 1,000 years, devastating entire sectors of the galaxy. In the end, the hegemony had won not through superior firepower, but through a strategy so ruthless that even they preferred not to remember it. They had infected the Vorthak with their own philosophy of perfection, gradually convincing them that chaos was a weakness to be eliminated. As the Vorthak became more predictable, more perfect, they became easier to defeat. The final battle had been almost anticlimactic, with the last Vorthak warriors falling to strategies that their ancestors would have countered instinctively. The armor had been sealed away, protected by layers of security that were designed to ensure that no species could ever successfully bond with it again. The hegemony had tested it on hundreds of different alien races, always with the same result: instant death. They had convinced themselves that the Vorthak way of warfare was extinct, that their perfect order had finally triumphed over primal chaos. But now, somehow, something had changed, and according to the initial reports, the new host was human. Meanwhile, back at the Galactic Museum of Ancient Artifacts, Junho was discovering that having godlike powers came with a steep learning curve. The museum's maximum security wing was not designed to contain someone who could accidentally punch through reinforced walls while trying to scratch an itch. "Okay, note to self," Junho muttered as he surveyed the wreckage of what had once been a display case containing ancient Zephyrian war masks. "The armor makes me about 50 times stronger than normal. Maybe ease up on the casual gestures." Rath's voice echoed in his mind with what sounded suspiciously like amusement. "Fascinating. Your species combines maximum chaos with minimal self-preservation. Instincts, most efficient warriors I've encountered in a millennium." Junho tried to lean against a wall and accidentally put his elbow through it instead. Chunks of reinforced concrete scattered across the floor like confetti. "Thanks, I think, though I'm not sure efficient is the word I'd use. More like barely controlled disaster." "Precisely," Rath replied. "The hegemony spent centuries trying to eliminate unpredictability from warfare. They succeeded in making themselves predictable. You, however, appear to be gloriously unpredictable even to yourself." Hyunwoo and Bora watched from what they hoped was a safe distance as Junho continued his impromptu demolition of their workplace. The museum director was frantically calculating repair costs while simultaneously trying to figure out how to explain this to the insurance company. Bora was taking notes, partly for the incident report, and partly because she was witnessing history in the making. "Should we try to stop him?" Bora whispered. Yunwoo shook his head. "Stop him with what? He just walked through a wall like it was made of paper. I say we let him practice somewhere that isn't full of priceless artifacts." Junho overheard them and grinned sheepishly. "Sorry about the mess. This is going to take some getting used. Tyrath, any suggestions for not accidentally destroying everything I touch?" "Practice," the AI replied simply, "and perhaps we should relocate to somewhere with fewer fragile objects. I suspect we will have visitors soon who are less concerned with museum property damage and more interested in preventing our continued existence." As if summoned by those words, every communication device in the museum began receiving the same message simultaneously. It was broadcast on every frequency, in every known language, with the kind of authority that belonged to those who controlled most of the galaxy. "Attention, citizens of the neutral zone. The artifact known as the Vorthak battlesuit has been activated illegally. The individual responsible for this breach of galactic security is to surrender immediately for processing. Failure to comply will result in immediate pacification of the entire sector. You have 1 standard hour to respond. The hegemony of perfect beings does not negotiate with chaos." Junho looked around at the wreckage he had caused, then at the terrified faces of the museum staff, then at the ominous message scrolling across every screen in sight. He sighed and cracked his knuckles, a gesture that now sent small fractures through the floor beneath his feet. "Well, Rath," he said, "looks like our practice time just got cut short. Any chance these hegemony folks are the reasonable type who might be willing to talk this out?" The AI's laughter was like distant thunder. "Oh, my dear human, the hegemony destroyed my creators for being too chaotic to control. What do you think they plan to do with you?" The hegemony's response was swift and overwhelming, exactly what you'd expect from a civilization that had spent millennia perfecting the art of crushing rebellion before it could spread. Within 6 hours of the alert, the largest military fleet in galactic history materialized at the edge of the museum system, their crystalline ships gleaming like deadly jewels against the backdrop of space. War Marshal Min Jun commanded the extermination. Fleet from his flagship, the Perfection's Edge, a vessel so large it had its own gravitational field. Min Jun was considered the finest military mind in hegemony history, a tactical genius who had never lost a battle in over 2,000 years of service. His strategies were studied in military academies across the galaxy, and his name was whispered with respect even by his enemies. He was also, like all members of the hegemony elite, absolutely perfect. His movements were calculated to the microsecond. His thoughts followed logical patterns that had been refined through centuries of genetic and cybernetic enhancement, and his tactical assessments were based on mathematical models that could predict the outcome of any conflict with 99.7% accuracy. Standing on the bridge of his flagship, surrounded by holographic displays showing perfect formations of perfect ships crewed by perfect soldiers, Min Jun felt the familiar satisfaction that came from overwhelming superiority. The museum system lay before them like a single candle flame before a hurricane, and the human who had somehow activated the Vorthak armor was about to learn what happened when primitive chaos met perfected order. "Tactical assessment," Min Jun commanded, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones that marked him as genetically superior to the crew around him. His aide, a perfectly efficient officer named Su Jin, materialized beside him with the fluid grace that came from enhanced reflexes and optimized muscle memory. "Target confirmed, War Marshal. One human male, designation Jun Ho, currently located within the Galactic Museum of Ancient Artifacts. The facility has been evacuated except for essential personnel. No significant defensive capabilities detected." Min Jun's lips curved into what his species considered a perfect expression of controlled amusement. "One human," he said, his voice carrying across the communication channels to every ship in the fleet. How much trouble could one primitive biped possibly cause? Even wearing stolen Vorthak technology, it remains a single organic being facing the combined might of the hegemony's finest. The fleet moved into attack formation with the kind of precision that came from thousands of years of military evolution. Each ship knew its exact position, each weapon system was calibrated to mathematical perfection, and each crew member performed their duties with flawless efficiency. It was, by every measure the hegemony valued, absolutely perfect. Back on the museum station, Junho was having what could generously be called a crash course in advanced warfare. Wrath had been patiently explaining the basics of the armor's systems while Junho practiced not accidentally destroying everything he touched. The learning curve was steep, but humans had always been surprisingly adaptable when their lives depended on it. "So let me get this straight," Junho said experimentally, flexing his fingers and watching energy crackle between them. "This armor basically turns me into a one-man army, but it also makes me a target for every perfectionist alien in the galaxy?" Wrath's mental voice carried what sounded like ancient amusement, an accurate summary. "However, I should point out that the hegemony's approach to warfare is based entirely on predictable patterns and logical responses. They have spent so long perfecting their tactics that they have forgotten how to adapt when faced with true chaos." "Great," Junho muttered. "So all I have to do is be more chaotic than a fleet of super-advanced alien warships. No pressure." That was when the first wave of attacks began. The hegemony's opening gambit was textbook perfect, a coordinated barrage of precision energy weapons designed to overwhelm the target's defensive capabilities through superior firepower. Every shot was calculated to hit with maximum efficiency. Every energy beam was tuned to the exact frequency that would cause the most damage, and every tactical decision was based on thousands of years of accumulated military wisdom. Junho's response was to launch himself directly into the middle of the attacking formation, while screaming something that roughly translated to, "Let's dance, you shiny jerks." It was exactly the kind of move that no sane military strategist would ever consider, which was precisely why it worked. The hegemony ships had been positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that would trap any logical opponent in a web of devastating energy. They had not planned for their target to ignore all concepts of self-preservation and charge straight through their perfect formation like a caffeinated missile. Did that guy just try to intimidate me by changing colors? Junho laughed as he dodged between laser arrays that had been designed to hit targets moving at predictable velocities. Several of the hegemony ships were indeed shifting their hull colors through patterns that were supposed to inspire fear and submission in enemy forces. "That's adorable." Wrath catalogued the enemy tactics with scientific interest. Enemy tactic. Tyson 47, intimidation via chromatic display. Effectiveness against humans, 0. Fascinating. Your species appears to be immune to psychological warfare techniques that work on 90% of known sentient life. The battle quickly devolved into what military historians would later describe as organized chaos versus disorganized perfection. Min Jun's ships executed flawless maneuvers that had been tested in thousands of simulations, while Jun-Ho responded with tactics that seemed to be improvised on the spot and made no logical sense whatsoever. When the hegemony fleet formed a perfect sphere formation designed to trap him in the center, Jun-Ho punched through the hull of the nearest ship and used it as a shield while attacking the others. When they adapted by spreading out into a wider formation, he somehow managed to be in 3 places at once, bouncing between ships like a pinball made of concentrated violence. The armor's capabilities seemed to expand with each impossible maneuver. Wrath provided running commentary and tactical suggestions, but increasingly, the AI seemed to be learning from Jun-Ho rather than the other way around. The human's completely unpredictable fighting style was pushing the ancient technology to evolve in ways its original creators had never imagined. Target is not behaving according to any known combat doctrine, Sujin reported, her perfect composure finally showing cracks. Our tactical algorithms cannot predict his next move because his actions appear to be random. Min Jun watched in growing horror as his perfect fleet was systematically dismantled by what appeared to be a single human having the time of his life. Ships that had never been damaged in centuries of warfare were being torn apart by attacks that shouldn't have been possible. Weapon systems that had been perfected over millennia were being countered by responses that made no tactical sense. Impossible, Min Jun whispered, watching as Jun-Ho somehow used a destroyed ship's momentum to slingshot himself into the middle of another formation. No single being should be capable of this level of destruction. The final straw came when Jun-Ho, apparently running out of ships to destroy in his immediate vicinity, grabbed a chunk of debris and threw it with such force that it punched through the shields of 3 ships simultaneously. The projectile had been nothing more than a piece of twisted metal, but the armor had somehow enhanced his throw to the point where it became a kinetic weapon capable of penetrating the hegemony's best defensive technology. Ship after ship fell to their impossible partnership of human creativity and Vorthak technology. Perfect formations crumbled under attacks that followed no logical pattern. Flawless strategies were countered by responses that seemed to be invented in the moment. And through it all, Jun-Ho's laughter echoed across the communication channels, the sound of someone who was genuinely enjoying himself in the middle of what should have been certain death. Min Jun was forced to make the most humiliating decision of his perfect military career. With over half his fleet destroyed or disabled, facing an opponent who seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment, the greatest tactical mind in hegemony history gave the order to retreat. As the surviving ships limped away from the battlefield, Min Jun composed his report with hands that trembled for the first time in centuries. He had to report the unthinkable. A single human wearing 1,000-year-old alien technology had defeated the perfect fleet that had never known defeat. The age of hegemony supremacy was over, and chaos had returned to the galaxy. The journey to the hegemony's throne world took 3 weeks, but it wasn't the peaceful cruise that Jun-Ho had hoped for. Word of his victory against the extermination fleet had spread across the galaxy faster than light-speed communication, and suddenly, every oppressed world, every rebel group, and every freedom fighter in known space was looking to him as some kind of savior. The pressure was getting to him. "I never asked to be a symbol of rebellion," Jun-Ho complained as he sat in the pilot's seat of a commandeered hegemony scout ship, watching the crystalline spires of Perfection Prime grow larger on the view screen. "I just wanted to pay off my debts and maybe get a decent meal for once." Wrath had been unusually quiet during the journey, processing vast amounts of tactical data and running combat simulations. But there was something else happening that Jun-Ho could feel at the edge of his consciousness. The AI was changing, evolving beyond its original programming in ways that even its ancient creators hadn't anticipated. "The armor is different now," Jun-Ho said, flexing his fingers and watching energy patterns dance across the dark metal. "It's not just responding to my thoughts anymore, it's learning from them adapting to the way I think and fight. That's not normal, is it? Rath's mental voice carried a note of wonder that hadn't been there before. No, it is not normal. My original programming was designed to enhance and amplify the natural abilities of Vorthak warriors, but your species approaches combat in ways that my creators never imagined. You are forcing me to evolve beyond my original parameters. The throne world of the hegemony was a monument to the concept of perfection. Every building was geometrically precise. Every street was laid out in mathematically perfect patterns, and every citizen moved with the fluid grace that came from generations of genetic optimization. It was beautiful in the way that a perfectly cut diamond was beautiful, flawless, cold, and utterly without soul. Junho's ship landed in the central plaza without any attempt at stealth. There was no point in being subtle when your arrival had been broadcast across the entire planet. The hegemony had cleared the streets of civilians, leaving only the perfectly programmed guards who stood at attention like statues made of living crystal. The palace of Supreme Commander Tai Min rose from the center of the city like a mountain of living light. Its walls were made from a substance that was part crystal, part organic tissue, and part pure energy. The structure pulsed with a heartbeat that could be felt through the armor, and Junho had the unsettling feeling that the building was somehow alive and watching him. Taemin was waiting in the throne room, standing at the center of a chamber that stretched up into darkness above and down into depths that seemed to have no bottom. He was even more perfect than his images had suggested, with features that had been refined through millennia of genetic engineering and a presence that radiated authority like a physical force. "So," Taemin said, his voice carrying harmonics that were designed to inspire awe and obedience, "you are the human who thinks he can challenge the natural order of the galaxy. You wear the armor of my ancient enemies and believe it makes you powerful enough to face me." Junho looked around the throne room, taking in the impossible architecture and the way light seemed to bend around Taemin's perfect form. "Nice place you've got here, very shiny. Must be hell to keep clean." The casual disrespect hit Taemin like a physical blow. He had spent 3,000 years being treated as a godlike figure, and the human's complete lack of intimidation was more unsettling than any threat could have been. "How you don't understand what you're dealing with," Taemin continued, his perfect composure showing the first tiny cracks. "The Vorthak were not defeated through superior firepower or tactical brilliance. We destroyed them by giving them something they thought they wanted: perfection." The Supreme Commander began to circle Junho like a predator, sizing up its prey, his movements fluid and precisely calculated. "We infiltrated their society with our philosophy, convinced them that chaos and unpredictability were weaknesses to be eliminated. Slowly, generation by generation, they began to perfect themselves. They standardized their tactics, optimized their strategies, and removed every trace of the beautiful chaos that had made them unbeatable." Junho listened with growing understanding, his hand unconsciously moving to rest on the armor's chest plate where he could feel Wrath's presence, like a second heartbeat. "And once they became predictable, you could beat them." "Exactly," Taemin said, drawing an energy blade that hummed with contained power. "Without imperfection, they became just another species to be conquered. And now you wear their final legacy, thinking it will save you from the same fate." The battle began without warning, with Taemin moving faster than human eyes should have been able to follow. His blade traced patterns in the air that were mathematically perfect, each strike calculated to exploit what his analysis had identified as weak points in the armor's design. It was a display of martial perfection that would have been beautiful if it hadn't been trying to kill Junho, but Junho didn't fight like the Vorthak had fought. He didn't even fight like any human warrior that Taemin's tactical databases had on file. His movements were part trained combat technique, part desperate improvisation, and part pure accident. He dodged Taemin's perfect strikes with moves that seemed to violate several laws of physics, and responded with attacks that made no tactical sense, but somehow found their mark anyway. "You fight like a drunken fool," Taemin snarled, his perfect composure finally cracking as his flawless techniques failed to land a killing blow. "Yeah, well, lucky for me, I'm spectacularly imperfect," Junho replied. dodging an energy blade. Thrust with a move that was part dance, part stumble, and part genius. And apparently that's exactly what this armor was waiting for. As the battle continued, something extraordinary began to happen. Wrath, pushed to its limits by Junho's completely unpredictable fighting style, began to evolve in real time. The AI that had been programmed to enhance Vorthak warriors was learning to think like a human, to embrace chaos and uncertainty as tools rather than obstacles. The armor began to change, its surface flowing and adapting with each exchange. Where Taemin's attacks were perfect and predictable, Junho's responses became increasingly creative and impossible. The human was teaching an ancient artificial intelligence how to be beautifully, chaotically, imperfectly alive. I comprehend. Now, Wrath whispered in Junho's mind, its mental voice filled with something that sounded almost like joy. Perfection is stagnation. Growth requires the courage to be flawed, to make mistakes, to fail and try again. My creators understood this, but I had forgotten until you showed me. Taemin felt the change in his opponent and recognized it for what it was. Evolution in action. The human wasn't just wearing the Vorthak armor anymore. He was transforming it into something entirely new, something that combined ancient wisdom with human creativity, producing a result that was greater than the sum of its parts. The final exchange lasted only seconds, but felt like an eternity. Taemin launched his most perfect attack, a combination of speed, precision, and power that had never failed to destroy his enemies. Junho's response was to do something that no tactical manual in the galaxy would have recommended. He tripped, but as he fell, the armor flowed around him like liquid light, turning his stumble into a spinning kick that caught Taemin completely off guard. The Supreme Commander's perfect defenses, calibrated to counter logical attacks, had no response to a move that appeared to be equal parts accident and inspiration. Taemin fell not to superior power, but to something his perfect society couldn't compute, the beautiful, chaotic, impossible creativity of humanity. As he lay on the crystal floor of his throne room, looking up at the human who had just shattered 3 millennia of hegemony supremacy, he finally understood what his ancestors had truly feared about the Vorthak. It wasn't their strength or their technology. It was their ability to grow, to change, to be imperfect and proud of it. The news of Taemin's defeat spread across the galaxy within hours, carried by communication networks that the hegemony had built to maintain control of their empire. But instead of maintaining order, the news sparked something that perfect societies couldn't handle. Hope. World after world began to rebel, not through coordinated military action, but through something much more dangerous to a society based on perfection. They began to embrace their flaws. Artists started creating imperfect beauty. Scientists began exploring chaotic theories, and ordinary citizens discovered that being perfectly human was more powerful than being artificially perfect. Junho and Wrath became the galaxy's most unlikely, liberators traveling from world to world, not as conquerors but as teachers. They showed oppressed populations that their imperfections weren't weaknesses to be corrected, but strengths to be celebrated. They demonstrated that chaos and creativity were forces that could overcome any tyranny, no matter how perfect it appeared. Standing on the observation deck of their ship, watching another world celebrate its newfound freedom, Junho reflected on how much his life had changed since he'd stumbled into that museum looking for easy money. "So," he asked Wrath as fireworks exploded in celebration below them, "ready for the next impossible Tuesday?" The AI's response carried warmth that would have been impossible for its original programming. "With you, my perfectly imperfect partner. Always." And somewhere in the depths of space, the galaxy continued to spin, a little more chaotic, a little more free, and infinitely more human than it had been before.